Marcus Webb found the missing stallion standing over 18 foals in a desert cave, his massive body covered in fresh wounds from fighting off predators. What the veteran discovered written on the cave walls would expose a criminal empire and put a target on his back. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert stretched endlessly before Marcus Webb as he guided his weathered pickup truck along the dusty trail that wound through the canyon lands of southern Utah. At 62 years old, the former Army veteran had seen more than his share of impossible situations during his 25 years of service, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet loneliness that came after retirement. The mountains had become his sanctuary, a place where the weight of memories could dissolve into the vast expanse of rock and sky. He came out here every few weeks to check on the wild horse populations, a volunteer position he had taken up 3 years ago when the silence of civilian life became too loud. That particular morning in late autumn carried an unusual chill. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the red sandstone cliffs that rose like ancient sentinels on either side of the narrow valley. Marcus had been following reports from other volunteers about strange activity near Devil's Canyon, a remote area known for its treacherous terrain and hidden caves. Local ranchers had mentioned seeing an unusually large horse in the area, one that didn't match any of the known wild herds. Some claimed it was just a trick of the light or an exaggerated story told around campfires, but Marcus knew better than to dismiss such reports outright. In his experience, there was usually a grain of truth buried beneath even the most fantastical tales. As his truck rounded a bend in the trail, Marcus noticed something that made him slow down. Fresh tracks crossed the path, far larger than those of any horse he had encountered before. The prints were deep, pressed firmly into the hardened earth, as if the animal that made them carried significant weight. He stopped the truck and climbed out, kneeling beside the tracks to examine them more closely. The span between the hoof prints suggested a stride of remarkable length, and the depth indicated an animal of extraordinary size and power. Marcus felt a familiar tingle of anticipation, the same feeling he used to get before a mission when something significant was about to unfold. Following the tracks on foot, Marcus grabbed his binoculars and a canteen of water before setting off into the scrubland. The trail led him away from the main path and deeper into the canyon system, where the walls narrowed and the vegetation grew sparse. He moved carefully, his military training keeping his steps quiet despite the loose rocks that littered the ground. The tracks continued in a relatively straight line, purposeful and determined, as if the horse knew exactly where it was going. After about 40 minutes of steady walking, Marcus began to hear something that stopped him in his tracks. It was the sound of hoofbeats, but not the scattered rhythm of a herd moving freely. These were organized, almost protective in their pattern. Mixed with the hoofbeats came something else, high-pitched whinnies and the unmistakable sound of young horses. Foals. Marcus's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Foals in this area at this time of year were unusual enough, but the sheer number of young voices he detected suggested something far more complex than a simple family group. Moving forward with increased caution, Marcus climbed a small rise that gave him a better vantage point. What he saw through his binoculars made him catch his breath in disbelief. In a natural amphitheater formed by the canyon walls stood the largest horse he had ever seen in his life. The stallion was magnificent, standing at least 19 hands high with a muscular build that seemed almost mythical in proportion. His coat was a striking golden palomino, gleaming in the morning sun like polished bronze. But it was not the horse's size alone that stunned Marcus. Surrounding the giant stallion were 18 foals, ranging in age from what appeared to be just a few weeks old to perhaps 6 months. They huddled together in a tight group, and the stallion moved around them in a constant patrol, his massive head swinging from side to side as he scanned the canyon walls. Marcus lowered his binoculars and blinked, wondering if the isolation had finally gotten to him and he was seeing things. But when he raised them again, the scene remained unchanged. The foals represented multiple breeds and colorations, from paints to bays to chestnuts, suggesting they had come from different herds or perhaps even domestic situations. None of them appeared to be offspring of the giant stallion, yet he guarded them with a fierce determination that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. As Marcus watched, trying to understand what he was seeing, movement in the distance caught his attention. 3 coyotes had appeared on a ridge to the north, their lean bodies silhouetted against the sky. They were watching the foals with obvious interest, calculating the odds and looking for weakness. The moment they started to descend, the giant stallion reacted. He positioned himself between the predators and the young horses, his massive frame creating an impenetrable barrier. He reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves slicing through the air as he issued a warning that echoed through the canyon like thunder. The coyotes hesitated, then retreated, clearly unwilling to challenge such a formidable opponent. Marcus felt his heart pounding as he witnessed this extraordinary display of protection. This was no ordinary situation. Something profound was happening here, something that demanded investigation and understanding. His eyes drifted to a dark opening in the canyon wall, behind where the horses stood, a cave entrance partially hidden by fallen rocks and desert brush. The stallion kept glancing back at that cave, as if guarding not just the foals but whatever lay within that shadowy space. Marcus knew in that moment that his quiet retirement had just taken an unexpected turn, and whatever secrets that cave held would change everything he thought he understood about loyalty, survival, and the extraordinary bonds that could form between creatures in the wild. Marcus spent the next 2 hours observing from his hidden position on the ridge, documenting everything he saw with the small notepad he always carried. The giant stallion never rested, not even for a moment. His vigilance was absolute, his attention divided between watching the surrounding landscape for threats and checking on the foals that milled about beneath him. The young horses seemed surprisingly calm given their circumstances, as if they had grown accustomed to their unusual guardian's presence. Some of the smaller ones even approached the stallion, nuzzling against his massive legs without fear. The gentleness with which he responded to them, lowering his great head to touch their small faces, was remarkable to witness. What struck Marcus most was the organization of it all. This was not chaos or random circumstance. The stallion had clearly gathered these foals deliberately, and he was maintaining a structured watch that would have impressed any military commander. Every 30 minutes or so, the horse would make a complete circuit around his charges, checking each one individually. He would pause to nudge any foal that wandered too far from the group, herding them back with patient insistence. When one of the youngest foals stumbled and fell, the stallion immediately moved to its side, using his massive body to help the little one back to its feet with surprising delicacy. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus noticed the foals beginning to show signs of thirst and hunger. Some of them called out in distress, their small voices carrying across the canyon. The stallion responded by leading them toward the cave entrance, disappearing into the darkness with his charges following closely behind. Marcus seized this opportunity to move closer, descending from his observation point and crossing the open ground as quickly as his aging knees would allow. He approached the cave carefully, pressing himself against the warm stone of the canyon wall as he edged toward the opening. The mouth of the cave was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily wide enough for the giant stallion to pass through comfortably. Marcus could hear movement inside, the shuffle of hooves on stone and the soft sounds of the foals settling down. He waited at the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim light before venturing further. What he saw inside made him stop and stare in wonder. The cave was enormous, a natural cathedral carved from the rock over countless centuries. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling high above, creating shafts of golden light that illuminated the space in an almost ethereal glow. But it was not the cave's beauty that captured Marcus's attention. Along one wall, someone had created a makeshift watering system. Large containers, clearly salvaged from various sources, had been arranged to catch water that dripped steadily from a seep in the rock face. The stallion was guiding the foals to drink from these containers, and Marcus could see that the water was clean and fresh. Near the containers lay scattered hay bales, some broken open where the foals had been feeding. The setup was crude but effective, and it raised an immediate question in Marcus's mind. Who had brought these supplies here, and how long had this operation been running? Marcus moved deeper into the cave, his boots crunching softly on the sandy floor. The stallion's head snapped up at the sound, his ears flattening against his skull as he positioned himself between Marcus and the foals. The horse's entire demeanor changed in an instant, transforming from gentle guardian to formidable protector. He pawed at the ground, sending up clouds of dust, and his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the veteran's survival instincts flare to life. This was not an animal to be taken lightly, and despite his size and obvious strength, Marcus knew that one wrong move could result in serious injury or worse. Marcus raised his hands slowly, palms out, in a gesture of peace. He had worked with enough animals over the years to understand the language of body posture and submission. He kept his movements minimal, his breathing steady, and his voice soft when he finally spoke. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not here to hurt anyone, just trying to understand what is going on." The stallion remained tense, his muscles coiled and ready to strike if necessary, but he did not charge. Instead, he watched Marcus with those intelligent eyes, seeming to assess whether this human represented a threat or perhaps something else. Behind the stallion, the foals had gathered into a tight cluster, their small bodies pressed together for comfort and protection. Marcus could see fear in their eyes, but also something else, a kind of trust in their massive guardian that transcended the usual animal instincts. These young horses had been through something traumatic. That much was clear from their behavior and their presence here in this remote location. But somehow, this giant Palomino stallion had found them, gathered them, and brought them to safety. Marcus took a small step backward, showing the stallion he meant no harm. The horse's posture relaxed slightly, though his vigilance never wavered. It was then that Marcus noticed something else about the cave, something that sent a chill down his spine despite the warmth of the day. Along the far wall, partially hidden in shadow, was evidence of human habitation. Not recent, but not ancient either. There were remnants of a camp, blackened stones from a fire pit, empty food containers, and most disturbing of all, lengths of rope and chains that had been cut and discarded. Marcus moved carefully toward the disturbing evidence, keeping one eye on the stallion, who tracked his every movement with suspicious attention. The chains were heavy-duty, the kind used for restraining large animals, and they had been cut with bolt cutters rather than simply unlocked. Someone had freed themselves or been freed by force. The rope showed similar signs of deliberate cutting, and as Marcus examined the frayed ends, he noticed dark stains that could have been blood. His military mind immediately began cataloging possibilities, none of them pleasant. This was not the scene of a simple camping trip gone wrong. This was something darker, something that spoke of captivity and suffering. Near the fire pit, Marcus found a torn piece of fabric that looked like it had come from a work shirt. The material was faded and weathered, but he could still make out part of a logo, some kind of ranch or livestock operation. He folded the fabric carefully and slipped it into his pocket, evidence that might prove useful later. As he continued his examination, the stallion relaxed further, apparently deciding that Marcus posed no immediate threat to his charges. The foals, sensing their guardian's acceptance, began to emerge from their tight cluster, curiosity overcoming their fear as they watched the strange human move about their sanctuary. Marcus stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and surveyed the cave with fresh understanding. This was not just a shelter. This was a rescue operation, a safe house created by someone who understood that these foals needed protection from something or someone. The question was, who had set this up, and where were they now? Those supplies suggested regular visits, but the dust and undisturbed nature of some areas indicated that whoever had been coming here had not returned in at least several days, possibly longer. The giant stallion approached Marcus then, his massive hooves making surprisingly little sound on the cave floor. Up close, the horse was even more impressive than he had appeared from a distance. His coat gleamed with health despite the harsh desert environment, and his eyes held an intelligence that was almost unsettling in its depth. Marcus had been around horses his entire life, had worked with cavalry units during his military service, but he had never encountered an animal quite like this one. There was something different about him, something that went beyond mere size or strength. Marcus reached out slowly, letting the stallion sniff his hand and make the decision about whether to accept contact. After a moment of consideration, the horse lowered his head and allowed Marcus to touch his broad forehead. The connection was electric, and Marcus felt a surge of emotion that caught him off guard. In that moment of contact, he sensed the stallion's exhaustion, his determination, and his desperate need for help. The horse was bearing an enormous burden, and he was running on empty, pushing himself beyond normal limits to protect the young lives that depended on him. One of the smallest foals, a little bay with a white star on her forehead, approached tentatively and pressed against Marcus's leg. She was thin, too thin, and when he ran his hand along her side, he could feel her ribs clearly beneath her rough coat. The foal looked up at him with enormous dark eyes that seemed to plead for help, for food, for safety, for everything that a young horse should have, but these foals clearly lacked. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he gently stroked the little one's neck. Whatever was happening here, these innocent creatures were caught in the middle of it and they were suffering. Marcus made a decision then, one that would complicate his quiet life, but which he knew was the only choice his conscience would allow. He would help these horses, would unravel the mystery of how they came to be here, and would make sure that whatever threat had driven them to this remote sanctuary would be dealt with properly. But first, he needed to understand more about their situation and gain the stallion's trust completely. That would take time and patience, two things Marcus had in abundance. He spent the rest of that day in the cave, observing the dynamics between the stallion and his charges, documenting the supplies and their condition, and taking photographs with his phone whenever the lighting allowed. The foals slowly grew accustomed to his presence, and by late afternoon, several of them were comfortable enough to approach him for gentle pats and scratches. The stallion watched these interactions carefully but seemed to understand that Marcus meant no harm. In fact, as the day wore on, the great horse appeared to relax for the first time, as if recognizing that he no longer had to bear his burden entirely alone. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, Marcus knew he needed to return to his truck before darkness made navigation dangerous. He had no supplies with him for an overnight stay, and he needed to report what he had found to the proper authorities. But leaving felt wrong somehow, like abandoning a post before his watch was complete. The stallion seemed to sense his reluctance and followed him to the cave entrance, the foals trailing behind like a small army of devoted followers. Marcus turned at the threshold and looked back at the unlikely family he was leaving behind. "I will be back tomorrow," he promised the stallion, who stood silhouetted against the fading light like some ancient guardian from legend. "I will bring food and water, and I will figure out what happened here. You have my word." The drive back to town felt longer than usual, Marcus's mind racing with everything he had witnessed. The dashboard clock read 7:15 when he finally pulled into the parking lot of the county animal control office, but the building was already dark and locked for the evening. He sat in his truck for a moment, debating whether to call the emergency line, but decided against it. What he had to report was urgent, but not an immediate crisis, and he wanted to speak with someone who would take the situation seriously, rather than dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone in the desert. Instead, Marcus drove to the local diner, a place where he often grabbed coffee and pie after his volunteer rounds. The owner, Linda Martinez, had become something of a friend over the past few years, one of the few people in town who seemed genuinely interested in his work with the wild horses. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had raised 3 children on her own after her husband died in a construction accident. She understood hardship and had a practical approach to problem-solving that Marcus appreciated. Linda looked up from wiping down the counter when Marcus walked in, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "You look like you have seen a ghost," she said, setting down her cloth and pouring him a cup of coffee without asking, "What happened out there today?" Marcus took a seat at the counter and wrapped his hands around the warm mug, trying to organize his thoughts into something coherent. He told her everything, from the oversized tracks to the giant stallion, to the 18 foals and the disturbing evidence in the cave. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Marcus finished, Linda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on the counter. She glanced around the empty diner, then leaned in closer. "I might know something about this," she said quietly. "About 3 weeks ago, maybe 4, there was a man who came in here late one night. He looked rough, like he had been living outdoors for a while. He ordered food but kept looking out the window like he was expecting someone to show up. When I brought him his meal, he asked if I knew anyone who might be willing to help rescue some horses." Marcus leaned forward, his heart rate increasing. "What did he say exactly?" Linda frowned, trying to recall the details. "He said there was a breeding operation up in the mountains, illegal he claimed, where they were stealing horses and forcing them to breed. He said the conditions were terrible and that there were foals being born that no one was caring for properly. Some were dying," he said. "He wanted to shut the operation down but needed help." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. "Did he say where this operation was located?" Linda shook her head. "He was vague about the location, paranoid even. He said if the wrong people found out he was talking, he would end up dead. He asked me to spread the word quietly, to find people who might be willing to help, but then he just left, paid in cash, and walked out into the night. I never saw him again." She paused, her expression troubled. "Marcus, I think he might have been the one setting up that cave. I think he was trying to save those foals on his own." The pieces were starting to come together in Marcus's mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than he had imagined. If there was an illegal breeding operation in the area, and if someone had been trying to sabotage it by rescuing foals, that would explain the chains and the evidence of captivity in the cave. But it did not explain the giant stallion, or how he had come to be the guardian of these young horses. "Did the man mention anything about a large horse?" Marcus asked. "A Palomino stallion?" Linda thought for a moment, then her eyes widened slightly. "Actually, yes. He said something about a champion stallion that had been stolen from a ranch down south. He said the thieves were using this horse to breed expensive foals they could sell on the black market. He seemed especially concerned about this horse, said the animal was being mistreated and was suffering." "Marcus, do you think that giant horse you saw could be the stolen stallion?" Marcus nodded slowly, everything clicking into place. "It would make sense. A horse that size and quality would be worth a fortune, and criminals would definitely target such an animal. But somehow, this stallion had either escaped or been freed, and instead of running away to safety, he had taken on the role of protector for the foals that had been left behind. The stallion was not just guarding them, Marcus realized. He was saving them, keeping them alive until help could arrive. Linda poured Marcus more coffee, her expression determined. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus sighed deeply. "Tomorrow I will go back with supplies and try to gain the stallion's full trust. Then I need to contact the authorities, but carefully. If there really is a criminal operation involved, I do not want to tip them off before we can secure the safety of those foals." Linda nodded approvingly. "You will need help. Let me make some calls tonight. I know a few people who might be willing to assist, people who can keep their mouths shut." Marcus felt grateful for her support, but also apprehensive about involving others. This situation was potentially dangerous, and he did not want anyone getting hurt, but he also knew he could not handle this alone. The foals needed proper care, veterinary attention, and protection from whoever had been running the illegal operation. Plus, there was still the mystery of what had happened to the man who had started the rescue effort. Was he still alive, or had the criminals caught up with him? Marcus barely slept that night, his mind churning through possibilities and plans. By 4:30 in the morning, he gave up on rest entirely and began loading his truck with supplies. He had stopped at the feed store the previous evening using his own money to purchase hay, grain, and special formula for young foals. He filled large containers with fresh water and added medical supplies from his own first aid kit. The back of his truck was packed so full he could barely see out the rear window, but he knew every bit of it would be needed. The drive to Devil's Canyon began before sunrise, the road ahead illuminated only by his headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus wanted to reach the cave early, partly to maximize his time with the horses, but also because he had a nagging feeling that time was running out. If the people running the illegal operation realized their stolen stallion and valuable foals were missing, they would come looking. The cave was remote, but not impossible to find for someone who knew the area well. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Marcus parked his truck at the same spot as the day before and began the hike toward the canyon. The weight of the supplies made the journey more difficult, but he pushed through the discomfort, driven by the memory of those hungry foals and their exhausted guardian. When he finally reached the ridge overlooking the natural amphitheater, he was relieved to see the stallion and his charges exactly where he had left them, safe and seemingly undisturbed. The giant palomino noticed Marcus immediately, his head lifting and his ears pricking forward with alert attention. But this time, instead of the aggressive posture from their first encounter, the stallion simply watched and waited, as if recognizing the human who had made a promise the day before. Marcus took this as a positive sign and began his descent into the canyon, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling the foals. When he reached the cave entrance, the stallion approached and sniffed the air, clearly detecting the scent of food. The foals, responding to their guardian's interest, began to gather around Marcus with hopeful expressions. Some of the bolder ones pushed forward, their small noses investigating the bags he carried. Marcus could not help but smile at their eagerness, though his heart ached at the evidence of their hunger. These babies should have been with their mothers, nursing and playing in green pastures, not struggling to survive in a desert cave. Marcus set down his supplies and began distributing food, starting with the youngest and most fragile foals. He mixed the special formula with water and offered it in buckets, watching as the little ones drank eagerly, their thin bodies trembling with the effort. The older foals received portions of grain and hay, and Marcus was careful to ensure each one got adequate nutrition. The stallion waited patiently until all his charges had been fed before approaching the food himself, a gesture of selflessness that impressed Marcus deeply. While the horses ate, Marcus took the opportunity to examine them more closely. Several of the foals showed signs of neglect and poor care. Their coats were dull and rough, their hooves overgrown and cracked. One small colt had an infected wound on his shoulder that needed immediate attention. Marcus cleaned it gently with antiseptic, murmuring soothing words as the foal flinched and tried to pull away. The stallion watched this process intently, seeming to understand that Marcus was helping rather than hurting. After tending to the most urgent medical needs, Marcus decided to explore deeper into the cave, hoping to find more clues about what had transpired here. The stallion followed him, and Marcus noticed that the great horse seemed different today, less tense and more willing to trust. Perhaps the act of bringing food and caring for the foals had proven Marcus's intentions. Or perhaps the stallion was simply too exhausted to maintain his defensive barriers any longer. In a section of the cave that Marcus had not examined the previous day, he found something that made his blood run cold. There were photographs pinned to the rock wall, old Polaroids that showed horses in various states of distress. Some were thin and injured, others were clearly pregnant mares being kept in cramped, filthy conditions. In one photo, Marcus recognized the giant Palomino stallion, though in the image he looked different, almost defeated. He was confined in a small pen, barely large enough for him to turn around, and there were visible marks on his body that suggested abuse. Marcus felt rage building in his chest as he looked at these images, evidence of cruelty and exploitation. But there was more. Beneath the photographs, someone had written notes on the cave wall in chalk, dates and locations and names. Marcus pulled out his phone and began photographing everything, documenting the evidence carefully. This information could be crucial in bringing the criminals to justice, but it also confirmed his worst fears. The operation was larger and more organized than he had imagined, with connections that reached beyond this remote canyon. As Marcus studied the wall, he noticed one name that appeared repeatedly: Dalton Reed. Beside the name were question marks and the words, "Find him." Marcus wondered if this was the man Linda had told him about, the one who had come into the diner seeking help. If so, what had happened to him? Had he managed to free the stallion and start rescuing foals before disappearing, or had something worse occurred? The stallion had moved to stand beside Marcus, his massive presence somehow comforting despite his size. The horse seemed to be studying the photographs as well, and Marcus could have sworn he saw recognition and pain in those intelligent eyes. This magnificent animal had suffered, had witnessed terrible things, and yet instead of becoming bitter or broken, he had chosen to protect the innocent. Marcus reached up and placed his hand on the stallion's powerful neck, feeling the warmth of his coat and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You are something special," Marcus whispered. "You have seen the worst of humanity, but you still chose to be a guardian." Marcus spent the rest of the morning caring for the foals and trying to win their complete trust. He named each one in his mind, giving them identities that went beyond their suffering. The small bay filly with the white star became Hope, a gray colt with gentle eyes became Spirit, a feisty paint foal became Courage. Naming them made them real in a way that statistics never could, and Marcus found himself emotionally invested in their survival in a way he had not anticipated. By noon, Marcus had made significant progress. The foals were eating regularly, the worst of their injuries had been treated, and several of them had even begun to play, engaging in the kind of normal young horse behavior that had probably been absent from their lives for far too long. The stallion watched these activities with what Marcus could only describe as satisfaction, as if seeing his charges act like normal foals brought him a measure of peace. But Marcus knew that this temporary sanctuary could not last. The foals needed proper veterinary care, vaccinations, and eventual placement in good homes. The stallion, despite his obvious strength, was showing signs of exhaustion that worried Marcus. The horse had been running on adrenaline and determination, But even the strongest spirit has limits. Marcus needed to make decisions quickly, but he also needed to be smart about how he proceeded. That afternoon, Marcus hiked back to his truck and drove into town to meet with Linda. She had arranged for several trusted friends to gather at the diner, people she vouched for completely. When Marcus arrived, he found 5 individuals waiting, each with unique skills that could prove valuable. There was Tom Chen, a large animal veterinarian with 20 years of experience. Sarah Blackwood, a former police officer who now ran a horse rescue operation. Miguel Santos, a tracker and wilderness guide who knew the Canyonlands better than anyone. Jennifer Hayes, a lawyer who specialized in animal cruelty cases. And finally, Robert Walking Bear, a Navajo elder whose family had lived in the area for generations and who had extensive knowledge of the land and its hidden places. Marcus laid out everything he had discovered, showing them the photographs from his phone and explaining the situation with the stallion and foals. The group listened in silence, their expressions growing more troubled as the full scope of the situation became clear. When Marcus finished, Tom Chen spoke first. "Those foals need immediate veterinary attention. From what you described, they are malnourished, and some have infections that could become life-threatening. We need to move them to a proper facility as soon as possible." Sarah Blackwood nodded in agreement but added a cautionary note. "We also need to be careful. If there is a criminal operation behind this, and they realize we are interfering, they might try to eliminate the evidence. That could mean harm to the horses or to us. We need to involve law enforcement, but we need to do it in a way that ensures the animal's safety comes first." Jennifer Hayes leaned forward, her legal mind already working through the complications. "I can file for emergency custody of the horses based on evidence of abuse and neglect. That will give us legal standing to remove them from the location, but we need solid documentation, which it sounds like you have been collecting." Miguel Santos, who had been studying the photographs of the cave and surrounding area, spoke up. "I know this location. Devil's Canyon has multiple entrances and exits. If we are going to move 18 foals and a giant stallion, we need to plan the logistics carefully. The terrain is challenging, and if someone is watching, we need alternative routes." Robert Walking Bear, the eldest of the group, had been quiet until now. He cleared his throat and addressed Marcus directly. "This stallion you described, this giant palomino, my grandfather told stories of a horse like this, a spirit horse that appeared in times of great need to protect the innocent. Some would say, what you have found is more than just a stolen animal. Some would say this is something sacred." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine at the elder's words. He was a practical man, shaped by military service and real-world experience, but he could not deny that there was something extraordinary about the stallion. The horse's size, his intelligence, his unwavering devotion to protecting the foals, all of it seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal animal behavior. Whether that made him sacred or simply exceptional, Marcus could not say, but he knew that the stallion deserved better than what he had endured. The group spent the next 2 hours formulating a plan. They would return to the cave the following morning with proper equipment and transportation. Tom would conduct veterinary assessments on site and determine which foals needed immediate intensive care. Sarah would coordinate with law enforcement contacts she trusted to ensure protection during the operation. Jennifer would have the legal paperwork ready. Marcus returned to the cave alone that evening, wanting to check on the horses one more time before the major rescue operation began. The sun was setting as he made his way through the canyon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers across the desert floor. Something felt different this time, a tension in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. His military training kicked in automatically, and he found himself moving more cautiously, scanning the surrounding cliffs for any sign of trouble. When he reached the cave entrance, the stallion was already waiting, his posture alert, and his ears swiveling to catch every sound. The foals were huddled together deeper in the cave, their usual playfulness replaced by an anxious stillness. Marcus approached slowly, speaking in low, reassuring tones, but the stallion moved to block his path. For a moment, Marcus thought the horse was rejecting him, but then he realized the stallion was not looking at him. The great horse was staring past him toward the canyon entrance, his entire body coiled with tension. Marcus turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife he kept on his belt. 3 men stood at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the dying light. They were rough-looking characters, dressed in worn work clothes and carrying equipment that Marcus immediately recognized as catch poles and tranquilizer rifles. These were not hikers or curious locals. These were professionals, men who knew how to handle large animals, and their presence here was no coincidence. The man in the center stepped forward, his voice carrying across the open space with casual menace. "Well now, looks like someone has been playing hero with our property. That is a real shame, old-timer. We have been tracking that stallion for 3 days, and we do not appreciate interference." Marcus kept his voice steady, projecting the confidence he had learned during decades of military service. "These animals are not your property. They are evidence of criminal activity, and law enforcement has already been notified." It was a bluff, but Marcus hoped it would buy time. The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Law enforcement? Out here? By the time any sheriff makes it to this location, this whole situation will be resolved. Now you seem like a reasonable man. Why do not you step aside and let us collect what belongs to us? Nobody needs to get hurt." Marcus did not move, his feet planted firmly in the sand. "I am not going anywhere, and neither are these horses." The stallion had moved up beside Marcus now, and the veteran could feel the raw power coiled in the horse's massive frame. The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance from either the old man or the animal they had come to reclaim. The leader raised his tranquilizer rifle, aiming it at the stallion. "Last chance, old man. These horses represent a significant investment, and we will do whatever it takes to protect our interests, even if that means putting down a stubborn animal and dealing with a meddling senior citizen." Before Marcus could respond, the stallion moved. With a speed that seemed impossible for a creature his size, the great horse charged forward, closing the distance between himself and the armed men in seconds. The men scattered, their weapons falling as they dove for cover. The stallion reared up, his massive hooves slicing through the air where the leader had been standing moments before. The display was terrifying and magnificent, a reminder that this was not some gentle farm horse, but a powerful animal pushed to the edge by suffering and determined to protect his charges at any cost. One of the men scrambled to retrieve his tranquilizer rifle, but Marcus was already moving. He might be in his 60s, but years of military training had left muscle memory that never truly faded. He kicked the rifle out of reach and placed himself between the weapon and the man. "You picked the wrong veteran to threaten," Marcus said quietly. "I have dealt with much worse than you, and I am not going to let you hurt these animals." The stallion had positioned himself at the canyon entrance, blocking the only easy escape route. The 3 men found themselves trapped, caught between an angry horse and an old soldier who was proving far more capable than they had anticipated. The leader pulled out a radio, and Marcus's heart sank as he heard the man call for backup. "We have a situation at Devil's Canyon. Bring the heavy equipment and additional personnel. We have a code red." Marcus knew he was outnumbered, and that reinforcements would arrive soon. He needed help, and he needed it fast. He pulled out his own phone, praying he had enough signal in the canyon to make a call. Sarah Blackwood answered on the second ring. "Marcus, what is wrong?" Her voice was sharp with concern. "We have a problem," Marcus said quickly. "The criminals are here, and they have called for backup. We need law enforcement now, not tomorrow morning." Sarah did not waste time with questions. "I am calling the sheriff right now. Miguel is with me. If we can be there in 30 minutes, can you hold out that long?" Marcus looked at the stallion still standing guard at the canyon entrance, then at the three men who were regrouping and clearly planning their next move. "We do not have a choice," he replied. "Just get here as fast as you can." He ended the call and turned his attention back to the immediate threat. The standoff stretched into an uneasy stalemate as darkness began to settle over the canyon. The three men had regrouped near the rocks, their weapons recovered but held with cautious respect now that they understood what they were facing. The stallion maintained his position at the entrance, a living barrier between the criminals and the Foals, who huddled deeper in the cave behind Marcus. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always did in the desert after sunset, and Marcus could see his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The leader of the group, a man Marcus now recognized from one of the photographs in the cave, pulled out a flashlight and swept it across the area. "You are only delaying the inevitable, old man. Our boss has too much money invested in that stallion and those foals to just walk away. When our backup gets here, and it will, you will wish you had taken the easy way out." Marcus remained silent, conserving his energy and watching for any sign of movement. He had been in worse situations during his military career, firefights where the odds were impossible and survival seemed unlikely, but he had learned that determination and strategy could overcome superior numbers. Behind him, Marcus heard the soft sounds of the foals moving restlessly in the darkness. The smallest ones were frightened by the tension they sensed, their small whinnies of distress cutting through the night air. The stallion responded to their calls without turning away from his guard position, issuing low, rumbling sounds that seemed to comfort them. Marcus was struck again by the depth of the horse's devotion, the way he balanced the need to protect with the need to reassure. This was not mere animal instinct. This was something far more profound. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. Marcus's legs ached from standing, and the cold was seeping through his jacket, but he did not dare show weakness. The three men had built a small fire, clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary for their reinforcements to arrive. They talked among themselves in low voices, occasionally glancing toward Marcus and the stallion with expressions that mixed frustration with grudging respect. One of them, younger than the others, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, shifting his weight and avoiding eye contact. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, Marcus heard the sound of vehicles approaching from a distance. His heart sank. If this was the criminal's backup arriving before his own help, the situation was about to become much more dangerous. But then he saw lights appearing from two different directions, and he realized with relief that one set belonged to Sarah's truck, recognizable by the distinctive pattern of her roof lights. The other was an official sheriff's vehicle, its emergency lights painting the canyon walls in alternating flashes of red and blue. The three men saw the law enforcement presence, and their demeanor changed immediately. The leader cursed under his breath and grabbed his radio again, speaking urgently to whoever was on the other end. "Cancel that backup request. We have law enforcement on site. Retreat to secondary location." The younger man looked relieved, while the other two appeared angry but resigned. They knew they had lost this round. Sheriff Tom Valdez emerged from his vehicle, a tall man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who had spent years working outdoors. He was followed by Sarah Blackwood and Miguel Santos, who had apparently met up with him on the way. The sheriff surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of an experienced lawman, taking in the armed men, the defensive posture of the stallion, and Marcus standing his ground despite being clearly outnumbered. "Well now," he said calmly, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Somebody want to explain what is happening here?" The leader of the criminal group tried to take control of the narrative. "Sheriff, We are just trying to recover stolen property. This man has been harboring animals that belong to our employer, and we have the documentation to prove ownership." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "Sheriff Valdez, these men are part of an illegal breeding operation that involves stolen horses and animal cruelty. I have photographic evidence inside the cave, including images that show this stallion being abused. These foals have been rescued from terrible conditions, and these men are here to take them back to continue their criminal enterprise." Sheriff Valdez held up his hand, silencing any response from the other group. "Everyone stay exactly where they are while I sort this out." He turned to Sarah. "You vouch for this man?" Sarah nodded firmly. "Marcus Webb is a decorated military veteran and a respected volunteer with the Wild Horse Protection Program. If he says there is evidence of criminal activity, I believe him." The sheriff considered this for a moment, then addressed the three men. "I am going to need to see this documentation you mentioned, and I am going to need identification from all of you. While we are at that, nobody moves without my permission. As the sheriff began the process of checking credentials and examining documents, Marcus finally allowed himself to breathe. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew this was far from over. The men in front of him were just employees, probably low-level operatives in a larger organization. The real power behind the illegal breeding operation was still out there, and they would not give up easily on assets as valuable as the stallion and the foals. Marcus caught Sarah's eye, and she gave him a small nod of understanding. They both knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The stallion seemed to sense the shift in dynamics and finally relaxed his aggressive posture, though he remained alert and watchful. Sheriff Valdez spent the next hour examining the evidence Marcus had documented, his expression growing increasingly grim as he viewed the photographs and read the notes written on the cave wall. The three men who had confronted Marcus were now sitting in the back of the sheriff's vehicle, handcuffed and awaiting transport to the county jail. Their identification had revealed criminal records involving animal theft and trafficking, which only strengthened Marcus's case. But it was what the sheriff found deeper in the cave that would change everything about how this case was understood. Marcus had been tending to the foals, trying to keep them calm after the stressful confrontation, when Sheriff Valdez called out from the back section of the cave. "Marcus, Sarah, you need to see this." The urgency in his voice made Marcus's stomach tighten with apprehension. He handed the bottle he had been using to feed one of the smaller foals to Miguel and made his way toward the sheriff's voice. Sarah was already there, her flashlight illuminating something that made her gasp audibly. In a narrow crevice that extended beyond the main chamber, partially hidden by fallen rocks, was a makeshift living space. It was clear that someone had been living here for an extended period, not just camping but actually residing in this hidden alcove. There were supplies, a sleeping bag, personal items, and most importantly, journals. Sheriff Valdez was carefully examining one of these journals, his face illuminated by his flashlight as he read. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "This is not just about horse theft. This is about something much bigger." Marcus moved closer, and the sheriff held up the journal so he could see. The entries were written in a tight, precise handwriting and dated back over 6 months. The author, who identified himself as Dalton Reed, had documented an extensive criminal network that stretched across multiple states. The illegal breeding operation was just one component of a larger enterprise that included money laundering, fraud, and connections to organized crime. Dalton had been an employee of the operation, a horse trainer who had become horrified by what he witnessed and decided to gather evidence to bring the entire organization down. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who had risked everything to do what was right. Dalton described how he had gradually gained the trust of the stallion who had been brutally mistreated by the operation's owner. The horse, whose registered name was Golden Thunder, had been stolen from a championship breeding farm in Kentucky 3 years earlier and had been forced to produce foals under terrible conditions. Dalton wrote about the dozens of foals that had died from neglect and abuse, their small bodies disposed of in the desert, where no one would find them. But it was the final entries that hit Marcus the hardest. Dalton had written about his decision to start rescuing the foals, bringing them one by one to this hidden cave where he had stockpiled supplies. He had freed Golden Thunder, knowing the stallion's size and strength would be essential in protecting the foals from predators while Dalton continued his rescue efforts. The stallion, despite everything he had endured, had accepted this role without hesitation, as if he understood that these innocent young lives needed a guardian. The last entry was dated 2 weeks earlier. Dalton wrote that he had been discovered by the operation security and had barely escaped with his life. He knew they would be searching for him and for the horses he had freed. He wrote that if anyone found this journal, they should know that every word was true and that he would rather die than let those innocent animals suffer any longer. He included names, dates, locations, and financial records that he had copied from the operations files. It was a treasure trove of evidence that could bring down the entire criminal network. But there was no sign of Dalton himself. Sheriff Valdez radioed for additional units and requested search and rescue teams to scour the surrounding area. "We need to find this man," the sheriff said grimly. "If half of what he documented here is true, he is in serious danger. The people running this operation have millions of dollars at stake and connections that reach into very high places. They will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their enterprise." Sarah was reading another section of the journal, her expression troubled. Marcus listened to this. Dalton writes about how the stallion saved his life twice, once when he was bitten by a rattlesnake and the horse carried him to safety, and another time when 2 men from the operation tracked him to the cave and the stallion fought them off. He writes that Golden Thunder is not just smart, he is extraordinary. Dalton believed the horse understood human speech and could sense danger before it appeared. He thought there was something almost supernatural about the stallion's abilities. Marcus thought back to his own experiences with the great horse, the way the stallion had seemed to read his intentions, the intelligence in those deep eyes, the deliberate choices the horse made. Robert Walking Bear's words about a spirit horse echoed in his mind. Whether supernatural or simply exceptional, Golden Thunder had proven himself to be far more than just an animal. He was a protector, a guardian, and perhaps even a hero in his own right. The sheriff closed the journal carefully and placed it in an evidence bag. "This case just became federal," he said. "I am calling in the FBI. With the interstate nature of this operation and the money laundering allegations, this is beyond local jurisdiction. But first, we need to get these foals to safety and make sure that Stallion gets the care and recognition he deserves." The rescue operation that unfolded over the next 48 hours was unlike anything the small Utah county had ever witnessed. Federal agents descended on the area, coordinating with local law enforcement to dismantle the criminal network that Dalton Reed had documented so meticulously. The evidence from the cave, combined with the testimony from the arrested men who quickly agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, led to 17 arrests across 4 states. The operation's leader, a wealthy businessman who had hidden behind layers of shell companies and legitimate enterprises, was taken into custody at his estate in Arizona. Tom Chen, the veterinarian, brought in a team of specialists to examine and treat the 18 foals. While all of them showed signs of malnutrition and neglect, none were beyond recovery. They were transported to Sarah's rescue facility, where they would receive months of rehabilitation before being placed in carefully vetted adoptive homes. Each foal would carry a piece of the story with them, a reminder of the darkness they had survived and the unlikely guardian who had kept them alive. But it was Golden Thunder who captured the public's imagination when the story broke in the media. News outlets across the country picked up the tale of the giant Palomino stallion who had protected 18 orphaned foals in a desert cave, fighting off predators and standing guard until help arrived. The original owner of Golden Thunder, A Kentucky breeding farm that had mourned his theft 3 years earlier came forward to reclaim him, but they did so with a request that surprised everyone. They wanted Marcus Webb to be the one to deliver the stallion home, recognizing that the bond between the veteran and the horse was something special that deserved to be honored. 3 weeks after that fateful confrontation in Devil's Canyon, Marcus found himself leading Golden Thunder into a custom horse trailer for the journey to Kentucky. The stallion had been examined by veterinarians and found to be in remarkable condition considering what he had endured. The scars on his body told stories of abuse, but his spirit remained unbroken. As Marcus prepared for the long drive east, the stallion pressed his massive head against the veteran's chest in a gesture that seemed almost human in its affection and trust. The journey took 4 days, with regular stops to rest and care for the horse. During those quiet hours on the road, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. He had come to the desert seeking solitude and peace, trying to escape the memories of war and loss that haunted him. Instead, he had found purpose again, a reminder that even in retirement, even in the twilight years of life, there were still battles worth fighting and causes worth defending. Golden Thunder had taught him that heroism was not about medals or recognition. It was about showing up when others needed you, about standing firm in the face of danger, about protecting the innocent no matter the cost. When they finally arrived at the Kentucky farm, Marcus was greeted by the owners, a family who had bred and raised Golden Thunder from birth. They wept openly at seeing their beloved horse again, their joy tempered by the knowledge of what he had suffered during his years of captivity. But they also expressed profound gratitude for Dalton Reed's courage and for Marcus's intervention that had saved not just Golden Thunder, but 18 young lives as well. The question of Dalton Reed's fate was answered 4 days after the initial rescue, when search teams found him in a remote part of the canyon, injured but alive. He had been hiding in a network of caves even deeper in the wilderness, surviving on minimal supplies while evading the men who hunted him. His leg had been broken in a fall. An infection had set in, but his determination to survive and see justice done had kept him going. He was hospitalized and later hailed as a hero, his evidence proving instrumental in the successful prosecution of the criminal enterprise. When Dalton was well enough to travel, the Kentucky farm owners arranged for him to visit Golden Thunder. Marcus was there for the reunion, and he would never forget the moment when man and horse saw each other again. Golden Thunder's reaction was immediate and profound. The great stallion whinnied with joy and cantered across the pasture, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Dalton, still on crutches, wept as the horse he had risked everything to save gently nuzzled his face. "You did it, boy," Dalton whispered. "You kept them safe. You kept your promise." Marcus returned to Utah, a changed man. He continued his volunteer work with wild horses, but with renewed purpose and energy. The experience had reminded him that the world still needed people willing to stand up for those who could not speak for themselves. He stayed in touch with Dalton, who accepted a position at the Kentucky farm working with Golden Thunder. The stallion, now in his prime and free from abuse, began a new chapter as a breeding horse, but this time under conditions of love and respect. The 18 foals all found homes, each one thriving in environments where they were cherished and cared for. Their story became a symbol of hope and resilience, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, compassion and courage could prevail. And whenever Marcus looked at the photographs he had taken in that desert cave, he remembered the giant golden horse who had shown him that true strength lies not in dominance, but in protection, not in power, but in devotion, and that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come in the most unexpected forms.